Hello. All of Year 9 are starting a new topic this term, and it's called The Living World. This is Lesson 1, What are ecosystems? Throughout this lesson, we will find out what an ecosystem is, what its elements are, and how those elements work together. Also, throughout this lesson, and all other lessons which I'll be setting in the same way, you'll find some instructions which are always highlighted in green, and when you need to pause, it should be highlighted in yellow. Let's make a start. So, here's your instructions. Write the date and title in your book and arrange these statements to make a definition for ecosystems. You will want to pause while you work it out. If you're unsure, the answer will be coming up soon. So pause now and give it a go. Here's the answer. An ecosystem is a natural system in which the living parts, plants and animals, and non-living parts, water, air, sunlight, soil and rock, interact. Copy this definition into your book. So let's have a look at this photograph. I wonder whether you recognise the place actually. There's another photograph that might help you recognise it. It's the park at Woollerton Hall. Well, looking at that, how many living and non-living parts of that ecosystem can you see? There's no need to write them down, just take a moment to think about them. I think it's a lot easier to identify the living parts of the ecosystem. Very obviously, we've got some deer, some trees and some grass. We could be more specific, of course. The deer are red deer. We could have a closer look at the trees and say which species of trees they are. I don't know from this photo, but I know from going to Woollerton Park that there are oak trees there are sycamore trees, there are plane trees and lime trees, and then there's the grass. Now, I know you perhaps think that all grass is the same, but there are actually different species of grass, and even then within the grass there are probably some other species, perhaps dandelions for instance, or bilberry. So for a different species of plants, trees, and then here in this photo we can see the red deer, but I can imagine that some birds are going to be part of this ecosystem, quite possibly some squirrels, earthworms, some beetles. Now, the non-living parts. Well, there is the air, the sunlight, the warmth or lack of warmth, so the temperature. There's going to be some water that comes from rainfall, sometimes from the snow, as you can see in the other smaller photograph. There's the soil itself. I know we can't actually see the soil in this photograph, but if the soil weren't there, then the grass wouldn't be there and the trees wouldn't be there. And I know that there's rock underneath the soil. So let's move on. You're going to need to learn some new geographical terms throughout this topic, and I'd like you to take a moment to pause and write these 4 things down in your book. We have biotic, meaning living or once living parts of an ecosystem. Abiotic, the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Flora and fauna. Plants and trees are flora, animals are fauna. Pause and write those things down. Right, here is an exercise for you to do. I'd like you to draw a little table and then use the words at the bottom to fill the table in, trying to get them into the correct column. So this would be a small pond ecosystem, a type of small pond that you might find it in a garden in England, or perhaps even the small pond that we have at school in the little garden in the square near science. So pause, put all these in. The answers are coming up in the next slide. Here are the answers. Please mark these with your red pen. I hope that you got all of these right. And next we're going to have a look at a picture of the small pond ecosystem. Here is an idealised diagram of a small pond ecosystem like the one you've just completed the table for. Let's have a little look around it. So starting with number 1. Above the pond surface, birds and animals breathe oxygen. Food is found in or on the water and in the margins. By margins, I mean the edges of the pond where the water meets the earth or the ground. Number 2. At the pond's surface, there's plenty of oxygen and light. Animals breathe through their gills or lungs or skin, or a combination of those three things. And number 3, the pond margin. This is the edge where the water meets the ground. There's plenty of oxygen and light here, plenty of shelter for the plants and insects and small animals or birds, plenty to eat. So there's lots of life at numbers 1, 2 and 3, just above the pond surface, at the surface and at the margin. Number 4, in the mid-water, so under the surface but not at the bottom of the pond. Animals here are breathing through their gills or skin. Fish will be the main predators in this ecosystem. If it were a larger pond, or like a lake for instance, then fish themselves might not be the main predators. It might be aquatic mammals, maybe otters for instance. They might be the main predator of this particular ecosystem. On to number 5. At the bottom of the pond there's little oxygen and there's little light. In reality, that pond water would probably be quite murky and muddy, and we might not even be able to see some of the animals in there. So there is plenty of shelter, there is some food, but you would tend to get less life at the bottom of the pond because there is less oxygen and less light. However, this is the place where decomposers and scavengers live. So decomposers break down dead and decaying matter. For instance, maybe at the end of a long and happy life, that predatory perch fish may pass away and sink to the bottom. At that point, then decomposers will break down the body of the fish and the nutrients will be then available in the water or sink into the sediment and into the mud. Scavengers. Scavengers are organisms that eat things that they find, that they come across. So a scavenger might be able to eat part of the dead perch, for instance, but it wouldn't have been able to hunt the perch whilst the perch was alive. Now, altogether, these things affect each other. They are interdependent. So an example would be, let's say, the water. The water is non-living, but clearly every living part of this ecosystem needs the water. Even the kingfisher. The kingfisher might not live in the water, but the kingfisher needs the water to be there because it hunts animals that live in the water. So, if the water in this ecosystem were to become polluted, then it would affect the plants and animals that live in and on the water, and it would affect the animals and birds and plants that live in the margins and that rely on the life of the pond for their own food and habitat. So now for you to draw a diagram, you're going to need at least one full page, and I recommend that you do it landscape. So I'd like you to copy out the definition of interdependence and then copy this small diagram. There is more to come, but pause for a moment to copy this, and then I'll go on to show you what happens next. Between each one of these elements, there is a line of interdependence that shows how the different elements affect each other and how they rely on each other. So I've done the first one for you. Plants, flora, they rely on the soil for nutrients, but the soil relies on the roots of the plants to hold it together. So they need each other in a way. If the roots of the plants or trees, for instance, aren't holding the soil together, then it could easily be washed away by heavy rainfall. It could be blown away by the wind. Now, copy that part out and then pause and see whether you can put in any other arrows. Think it through. Some of them are very difficult, but I've got some full answers coming up shortly. Here's some more answers for you to either confirm what you've been thinking, or you can copy some of these in if you like. So, between the flora and the fauna, well, animals rely on plants as their source of food. Either the animals eat the plants, or the animals eat other animals that eat the plants. So it's either a direct or an indirect relationship. Plants rely on animals to help them pollinate. So bees and other insects help plants to pollinate. Also, insects and birds help to spread the seeds of different plants. And things like earthworms and beetles that live in the soil around the roots help to aerate the soil. So that helps the roots to take up some water, for instance. Now, between fauna and climate. Well, animal species adapt to the climate they live in. Let's think. Polar bears, for instance, are specially adapted to living in a cold, icy, snowy environment. However, an individual animal is also affected by the climate. So the whole species of polar bears are adapted to living in a polar environment, but an individual polar bear might find itself having a particularly warm day or a particularly cold day. It might find itself in trouble because there's too much distance between the icebergs that it has to swim in between when it's hunting. So some animals have an impact on the climate too, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think, well, the animals I'm thinking of there are human beings. We definitely have had an impact on the climate. But now, between climate and soil. Well, the action of the climate helps to make the soil by breaking down rock. This is something that we're going to look at in more detail in another unit of work, so just take my word for it for now. The soil has an impact on what happens to the rainfall. The soil can't change climate, but it does change what the impact of the climate is. For instance, some soils are very heavy and sticky. They're called clay soils, and rain would waterlog them quite quickly and it kind of be stuck there. However, other soils are really quite sandy, and those soils drain quite quickly. So heavy rainfall falling on a sandy soil would drain into and through the soil, maybe going into the rock underneath it. Again, this is something that's quite complicated, but we will be coming back to it in another unit of work. There's also these interconnections, so between climate and plants. I think the most obvious example here would be a cactus. A cactus is specially adapted to a hot and very dry climate. Now, a very large ecosystem can have an impact on the climate. When I say very large, I mean like the Amazon rainforest, for instance. Between fauna, animals, and soil. Well, animals provide nutrients that break down and add to the soil. Previously, I used the example of the very happy elderly perch who passed away and sank to the bottom of the pond. And then I said that the body would be decomposed and add nutrients to the sediment. So those nutrients can later be taken up by plants, of course. Well, an animal doesn't have to die to provide nutrients that break down and add to the soil. You have to think about that. The soil also provides habitats for animals. A lot of animals live in the soil, or they live underground, they live just on the surface of the soil, perhaps. And when I say a lot, I'm thinking of lots of, millions of insects, for instance. So, in summary, we have seen that an ecosystem is a natural system in which the living parts and the non-living parts interact. We've learnt the words biotic and abiotic. These are elements of the ecosystem. Biotic are living or once living, and abiotic are the not living parts. We've started using the words flora and fauna. Flora for plants and trees, fauna for animals, and they're the living parts of an ecosystem. Interdependence is the way in which all the elements of the ecosystem affect the others. And we've looked at a case study example, which is a small pond ecosystem. Next lesson, we're going to build on this by looking at food chains, food webs, change in an ecosystem, and a really excellent case study example, which is what happens when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park. Now that you have completed this lesson, you need to check in again with your teacher on Teams. Please make sure that you do that before signing out of this lesson. Thank you very much. See you next time for Lesson 2.